BBC News reported recently that police have ended their investigation into a pro-Palestinian protest who vandalised a historic British painting. The group targeted the painting, claiming that it symbolised the bloodshed of the Palestinian people since the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917. This painting that was defaced was a painting of Lord Balfour. In this two-part series, we're going to examine the facts behind the Balfour Declaration. We'll see how this is a direct fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Join us now as we start this fascinating two-part series.
Only 67 words long, isn't it? And has been subject of some interesting comments. One historian observed that the Balfour Declaration may be the most extraordinary document produced by any government in world history. It took the form of a letter from the government of His Britannic Majesty King George V, the government of the largest empire the world has ever known, on which, once upon a time, the sun never set. A letter to an international financier of the banking house of Rothschild who had been made a peer of the realm. That's a bit of a mouthful, and we'll explore some of those thoughts in a bit. Here's another one. One nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third. And had Winston Churchill, who generally seemed to have a good quote about something to say, I didn't find one particularly on this topic at this point, but if he had, perhaps he would have said something like this: never in the field of foreign policy have so few words been debated so widely by so many. He didn't quite say that, but he might have done, mightn't he? So what we're going to do this afternoon is look at this question and try to answer these questions. What was it all about? What influence did it have? And what is its meaning today? And what we're going to do in the first half is really think about the historical context and the details of that declaration. And then in the second half, if God permit, we're going to go on and look at what we believe to be his word and what it says, and how that declaration and the events that followed it fit into what he has written. Worth reflecting, of course, that it hasn't been universally admired, has it? Those are just some press cuttings from the last couple of weeks that reflect the different tone that various of our media strikes. It certainly generated a lot of interest, as you see there, and also a lot of comment. And the Prime Minister, of course, herself making a specific speech in relation to it and hosting a dinner. I suppose, in a way, we have to start the story back with the roots of Zionism itself. The idea of the Jews having their own homeland, which turned out to be Palestine. And the roots really might go back to what has become known as the Dreyfus Affair, which was all to do with the gentleman you see on the screen here, Alfred Dreyfus, who in the 1890s was stripped of his soldier's garments, as you see there, and robbed of his position. And there were all kinds of other things went on because of his being a Jew. And this so moved a Jewish newspaper journalist who was covering the trial. Well, he made these comments. His name was Theodor Herzl. He said, if France can get caught up in a maelstrom of anti-Semitism and let the Parisian crowd chant, kill the Jews, where can they be safe once again, if not in their own country? He was France, the very champions of the revolution, freedom for all. And yet they were treating somebody in this way because of their nationality. And how were the Jews then going to be safe? Assimilation, the idea that the Jews could just become like anybody else and live in any other nation and be safe. Assimilation, he says, does not solve the problem because the Gentile world, the non-Jewish world, will not allow it. So that sowed in his mind the idea that what he had to do was launch what was called the Zionist Congress, which met in Basel in Switzerland. I have an invitation here to the Basel Congress from 1897. I have to be honest, it's not actually an original. You're welcome to see it afterwards. It comes from this rather wonderful collection that some of you might have come across, which has within it facsimiles of all kinds of interesting documents. Do come and look at that afterwards if you'd like. But the program that's in there, that they're going to talk about, was all to do with their hopes for a homeland for the Jews, those who were being persecuted in various parts of Europe. And the formula they adopted, as you see there, was that Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. That was what they were aiming at. And when they held their big gathering, that's what they were aiming to do. And there were all kinds of efforts that they took forward to try to progress that goal in the years that followed. For example, in 1903, actually 3 events, Herzl went to see, obviously, the prominent religious leader of the day, went to try and see the Pope and to say, well, would you support us as Jews in going back to the land of Israel? And he was told, not possible. And so he tried another attempt. He spoke to the British Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, and he had another idea. He said, well, look, just at the moment, there's somebody else there in that place that you want to go back. There was a big empire there called the Ottoman Turkish Empire that was in the way. And he said, look, if you go to this little corner of Kenya, at least you can be safe. And you can be all together, and that will be okay, won't it? And we'll support you in that. And it was rather misleadingly called the Uganda scheme, but that was one idea at one point. And in fact, Herzl went to the next Congress that he had in 1903, and he put this idea forward to them, but they weren't in favour of it. Because you remember that one of the key objectives that they'd had was it should be a legally assured homeland for the Jews in Palestine. That was the place they wanted. And so that wouldn't do. And as it happened, Herzl actually died the following year in 1904. And so his place in that movement was taken by a man called Chaim Weizmann. Now, Weizmann was a Russian Jew with a huge talent for science, particularly for chemistry. And having studied in Germany, he came across to this country and studied in Manchester. And he was one of those who had attended that conference, and he voted most strongly against that idea of going to Uganda. He said it has to be Palestine. For him as a Jew, his identity lay there. His belief was tied up with that place, and for reasons that we'll consider later. So, a very prominent man as he became in the Zionist movement. Well, here we are in the early years of the 20th century. Of course, some of you weren't even born in the 20th century. I'd just say, no, I was. And alongside, not quite as old as these events, there was Arthur Balfour. Well, he had been the Prime Minister, or was the Prime Minister at this point, actually. He'd been an MP since 1885. He was a religious man. As you see there, he was a Scottish Presbyterian. And that meant he read his Bible. One commentator says he was profoundly versed in it. His niece recorded that he loved to read from the prophets, great meaning and fervour. It was a book he knew well, and it meant something to him. In fact, he actually said on one occasion, Christian religion and civilization owes to Judaism an immeasurable debt, shamefully ill repaid. He looked at the Christian faith as he understood it, and he said it's underpinned by the Jewish faith. If you like, the New Testament is underpinned by the Old Testament. The two go together. And it is indeed the case that to understand the New, well, you certainly don't get beyond the first verse of the New Testament without reference to an Old Testament character. So, interesting man that he was. And we know of him, at least insofar as his name is lent to that declaration of which we've spoken. How then were these two people that I've just introduced, Weizmann on the one hand and Balfour on the other, how were they to come together? There's no automatic linkage between these people. A Russian emigre who is aiming to have a Jewish state in the Middle East and on the other, a member of the British government, who at the present time is the Prime Minister. How do those two come together? It's quite interesting. Here's Weizmann. And as I said, he's this able chemist who's come to the UK. And there is Balfour. Well, there is a man, first of all, called Charles Dreyfus, who founded a chemical factory in Manchester. And he was himself, as a Jew, a pillar of the local Jewish community. And he had, in fact, headed up their local Zionist committee. He met Weizmann at Basel at that Congress I referred to for Zionists in the early 1900s. And in due course, when Weizmann came over to the UK, he offered him a job during the summer for 3 years when he wasn't involved in university work. Well, it so happens that there's Dreyfus and Weizmann. At the same time, Dreyfus was also the local constituency member and chairman for Balfour's constituency. So when Arthur Balfour was campaigning in the general election in 1905, early 1906, having just resigned as Prime Minister, well, then actually it was this man, Dreyfus, who was arranging that campaign. And Dreyfus, by the way, was a relative of that Dreyfus I started with, that had sowed the seed of Herzl's idea of Zionism. So it was the very natural thing then that Dreyfus, having on the one hand known this brilliant scientist who was a Zionist, Weizmann, and knowing Balfour on the other, should introduce them, which is indeed what he did. And so when they met, and they were supposed to meet, I've read for about a quarter of an hour, you can imagine in an election campaign, you're supposed to be out there. But Balfour he wasn't quite your average politician, I think that's fair to say. And he had an interest, and he ended up talking for an hour and a quarter, so he probably didn't do quite so much canvassing that day. But the discussion they had went along these lines, because Weizmann asked Balfour why he had rejected the Uganda scheme that I spoke of. And Weizmann asked Balfour what he would do if he were offered Paris instead of London. And Balfour says, well, we've already got London. And Weizmann says, yes, but we had Jerusalem when London was a marsh. You think, Balfour, you can look back over a glorious, Anglophile history. But you've got to remember, there's a nation here that's been in existence for thousands of years, the nation of Israel, as he could look back to it. So what of Balfour's own understanding? He actually spoke of this and of the significance of that discussion with Dreyfus. He wrote the introduction to a book by a very prominent Zionist called Nahum Sokolov, and he said these, I'm just paraphrasing some of the key points. He'd always been interested in the Jewish question. He'd supported that idea that Chamberlain had put forward, well, go for that Uganda option. He'd supported that because it would allow the Jews to escape somewhere. But the conversation with Weizmann had convinced me that history could not be ignored. And so, he said, the position of the Jews is unique. For them, race, religion, and country are interrelated, as they are interrelated in the case of no other race, no other religion, and no other country on earth. That's quite interesting, isn't it? He observed that nation, and he said there's something amazing here. There's a tie not only to nationality and religion, but to this particular place. And he observed that. So we come then, of course, to the First World War, which was dominating every politician's mind, everybody's mind, wasn't it? It was anywhere near it at all. And you can see the main power blocks perhaps there. You can make them out. On the one hand, you've got France and you've got Germany. You've got France and Russia on one hand, and Italy and the United Kingdom. And on the other, you've got the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Turkey, which had sided with it just down there at the bottom of the map. And these two great power blocks, as the First World War proceeded. Now, one historian has identified three really key things that happened in 1917. The first was that Britain and Turkey Well, before, Britain had been supporting Turkey as it had begun to lose power, and Turkey then switched away from Britain and went and supported, as I said, that Germanic power. And so now there was a real change of alliances. At the same time, the Russian Revolution happened a little later, happened in 1917, I should say, which meant that now the Jews, perhaps, might, having overthrown the Tsars, favour the Allied cause, the anti-German movement. And similarly, in that year, the US was brought into the war because the Germans had attacked US shipping. And so now the Allied success was now not in doubt. You had America behind you, and they were friendly to the Jews as well. So you had really a new arrangement here. So if you were like Hein Weizmann, a Zionist at that time, you'd be interested, wouldn't you, to see the way that these things would develop as you lobbied for your movement in the Middle East. Well, there were other movements abroad as well. The Sharif of Mecca was a traditional steward of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and the surrounding area. But around this time, because of the pressure that was now being brought to bear on that Turkish empire that I spoke of, well, he was about to lose some of that authority. And he had dealings with the High Commission in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, and a promise was made to the Arabs that there would be a British recognition and support for their independence in certain areas. But there was a bit of a lack of clarity about whether that actually included Palestine itself. And to this day, that's a matter of some debate. Later on, McMahon actually stated, well, I never actually meant Palestine when I was talking about that. I was talking about other areas. Be that as it may, that was one complexity. And of course, there was another, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret deal that when Britain and France overthrew the Turkish Empire, then together with Russia and Italy, they would divide up the Arab territories between them. And that would lead to certain places for the Arabs as well. And I rather like the idea, as you can see on this map, where they get out their crayons on the right-hand map there, and they draw out the territory as you could, if you had that position of power, couldn't you? And at the bottom of the map, they even signed their name. And so this is it. We've now carved up the Middle East, and this is where everybody's going to be. Of course, things rarely end up quite in that way. They allocated certain areas to Britain and certain to other places, and that had later implications too. Well, there were changes in 1916 because two key members of the British government went out of the picture. First of all, there was Lord Kitchener, the man who's endlessly aped, isn't he, today, and all kinds of posters, your country needs you with a pointing finger. Lord Kitchener drowned at sea in 1916, and, Prime Minister Asquith came to an end. Gradually losing, his government lost confidence in him and had to resign. And interestingly, those two, it is recorded, were not in favour of a Zionist arrangement in the Middle East. And in their place came Lloyd George. I know we've got a fairly strong Welsh contingent today. Well, David Lloyd George was from that part of the world. And when he became Prime Minister, he did away with, it changed a lot of things. He did away with a large cabinet. He said, I just want these 5, the key decision-making. It is easy to make decisions if there's fewer of you, isn't it? And he said, well, that's what I'm going to have, a 5-man cabinet. In fact, he created a cabinet office with a forerunner, at least of today's cabinet office, that helps the wheels of government to run, and put them in huts in the garden of Number 10 initially, which the mind dreams about, really. But he appointed as his foreign secretary the same Arthur Balfour of whom we've spoken. And so now here he was, having no longer been Prime Minister, but as Foreign Secretary, in charge of the events of the countries that he had dealings with and relations with others. And he also set up a much larger imperial war cabinet that drew in representatives from the empire all over. And so we come to that critical question, really, which is, well, then, when we think about the Balfour Declaration, why was it that they decided to do this? Here they were, after all, in the middle of a war. Why should they decide that what they needed to do was now sign something that would support one particular group of people in one of the lands that they wanted to free? And a number of ideas have been put forward. One was, well, actually, they had perhaps an inflated view of the power that Jews exerted in the world. They are, after all, it was said, well, they're very powerful, they're very rich. That was certainly the case. That they're in all over the place, and if you can get the right side of them, then you'll win the war. And others said, well, you've got that Russian Revolution going on, and maybe you can use them. If you go out in favour of Zionism, you'll get them to your cause. Similarly, you have the French, who also have interests in that area. Maybe you can steal a march on them. There was another theory that has been put forward to why they did it, that actually, well, there's Weizmann, who, in another development we won't go into too far, but he'd helped the British government through his chemical inventions and enabled them to develop armaments, and maybe you owe something to Weizmann. Another interesting one was that, well, you've persecuted these Jews, you Christians, and so maybe you need to reward them. Unlikely to have been Balfour's own perspective, because he'd never, in his own religious tradition, accepted persecution of Jews. Perhaps there was a suggestion that the Germans were about to, in fact, make some kind of declaration in favour of the Jews in the Middle East. After all, they were fighting in the same territory, and if that happened, then maybe the British would lose the support of the Jews in that way. At the same time, of course, we had the whole growth of the British Empire at stake, and the access to the Suez Canal and other key strategic areas. And maybe if we had some kind of foothold there, it would be very useful. Now, all of those ideas have been put forward. Interestingly enough, the son of Mark Sykes, who I referred to just a few moments ago, a noted historian, Christopher Sykes, and he says nobody knows why they made the Balfour Declaration. All of those are possible. But one view which has been put forward quite strongly by a number of historians is the idea that actually it was their Christian Zionism, it was their Bible-fueled faith that drove them to do what they did. That afterwards there were all kinds of reasons that were given, including Lloyd George himself. But deep down was a recognition that this was a unique people and a unique land. Just to say a little about David Lloyd George, he came from a very interesting nonconformist background, which included a complete reading of the Bible, rather like Balfour has said before, a complete reading and a learning by rote, learning whole passages of the Bible. And in fact, looked to Cromwell as a hero, one who himself looked for a return of Israel to the land. He actually made this interesting comment: "You won't be offended if I tell you that the names of these valleys and hills in Canaan are as sacred to the Gentile as they are even to the Jew. I heard of Jezreel and Esdraelon, of Carmel and of Zion, before I knew of the existence in my own land of the valley of Glamorgan or of Plinimon." Quite an interesting reflection when you think of it. And so now this Balfour Declaration was to be written to dear Lord Rothschild, it was stated. And we'll look at that in a moment. But this Lord Rothschild was the leading member of the Jews of the day in this country. Quite an interesting man. He was the son of the first Jewish peer. He kept kangaroos in his garden, that's right. And he harnessed zebras and he drove them to Buckingham Palace to prove that they were dangerous. However, interesting as it is, that's not the key point that we're concentrating on today, because he was asked by Balfour to put together then some idea of, well, if we were going to make some declaration in favour of you being in the Middle East and having your own state as Jews, what would it be? And this was Lord Rothschild's original draft. And he actually said, His Majesty's government, after considering the aims of the Zionist organisation, accepts the principle of recognising Palestine as the national home of the Jewish people and the right of the Jewish people to build up its national life in Palestine under a protection to be established, at the conclusion of peace following upon the successful issue of the war. I think full stops must have been more expensive in those days. But you see the point? We want to recognise Palestine as the national home for Jewish people. It's going to be in Palestine, and the British government are going to support it. As you see there in the second paragraph, he talks about internal autonomy, freedom of immigration, and some kind of centralised body that would there be to make it happen. Well, there were all kinds of drafts that we don't have time to go through, and the next one involved ripping everything out. But the important thing, I suppose, is what we ended up with was the word that we're familiar with. We talked, in fact, about a national home for the Jewish people. Not the national home, and not Palestine being the national home, but a national home for the Jewish people. And it's the establishment in Palestine. Not that all of Palestine is the home, but that there is a home in Palestine. You see the difference? And there's all kinds of reasons why it ended up as that, to meet the needs and concerns of various people in the cabinet. One of them, interestingly, was the only one who was strongly against the declaration. Some of them said, well, look, you've got to be a bit careful because, well, I've been there recently and it's a complete mess, really. And there's malarial swamps and things like that, which we have to admit were rather a challenge. But there was one who said no on principle, and his name was Edwin Samuel Montague. And he was the only Jew in the cabinet. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Of all of those who were there, the only one who wasn't in support was himself a Jew. And he made a submission to cabinet that said, well, this is why it's not really a Jewish nation. We're just sharing the same religion. That's how he saw it. But Balfour said there's no place on earth where you have nationality and religion and place all bound together. He could see it. This Jew said, no, we're just sharing the same religion. If Palestine is a national home for the Jews, then Jews will be forced out of other countries. When they go there, they'll take all the best out of the land and drive out the present inhabitants, and they won't be able to understand each other because they talk so many different languages. And interesting just to reflect how that all played out. And he made a final comment. He said, I always understood that to bring the Jews back to the land, well, it would require some kind of Messiah figure. And I don't think Balfour or Rothschild fits that. Just interesting, isn't it? Just hold that in our mind. That actually he said, it can't happen. We need some kind of divinely appointed person to do it. So the cabinet in favour, with one exception, and they had all kinds of discussions between about June and the end of October in 1917. And here, in fact, are the minutes of that final meeting. And Balfour made one final plea and demonstration for why he wanted it to happen. And he said, well, some form of protectorate under which full facilities would be given to the Jews to work out their own salvation and to build up a real centre of national culture and a focus of national life. That was his desire. Jews to work out their own salvation, quite an interesting phrase, and a centre of cultural and national life. He said, it wasn't my intention that it should involve the early establishment of an independent Jewish state, but it is a matter for gradual development in accordance with the ordinary laws of political evolution. He didn't say he wasn't expecting there would be one day a Jewish state. He says he didn't look for an early one and that it might gradually happen. And that's important in the events that later took place. So the letter was signed. And a matter, as you can imagine, for those Jews who had looked for that, a time of great rejoicing. Only the next month, in fulfilling what Lloyd George has asked him, a general in the Middle East, in the British Army, General Allenby, actually succeeded in taking Jerusalem itself. And that, again, was a quite epoch-making event as the First World War began to draw to its conclusion. Churchill asked, how might a state emerge? He was asked that question a few years later, and he made this important point. He said, Palestine's ability to absorb more people, they would be able to develop agriculture, and it would begin to be possible, so that as the Jewish population increased, it could become a majority. He said, well, there would be justice and fair consideration to those displaced, and in time, they would become an overwhelmingly Jewish state. So that's Churchill's own reflection, looking back at what had happened. And of course, things did indeed progress, but not quite as smoothly as he might initially have hoped. So in our second half, we'll reflect back on some
Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share the video if you thought it was interesting. See you next time, God willing.